Our next speaker is Dr. David Hume, who is going to address, if you like, Unionist reactions to the 1916 Rising. Dr. Hume is well known as an historian. His current position is as Director of Services at the Orange Order. He was educated at the University of Ulster and is a former journalist. He's written extensively on the 1798 Rising in Eastern Ulster, on Ulster Unionism and on Orangism. And his theme this evening is Contemporary Unionist Views of the 1916 Rising. Dr. David Hume.
Good evening, everybody. I grew up in a community which is 92% single identity Ulster Protestant community, so the main relevance of 1916 from the point when I would have become interested was not in the events in Dublin, but events further away in France and the Battle of the Somme. And although as a Presbyterian community we were very aware of our part in 1798 when it was a hotbed of rebellion, the later Republican Rising in April 1916 was really far from our understanding and, dare say, interest. And that in itself, I think, says something important about the course of Irish history from that period in 1798 right through to 1916. Even with the benefit of a wider sense of history then, Easter 1916 sort of largely eluded me. And I suppose, to be quite honest, I would have seen it as just simply not my history. So therefore it wasn't really terribly relevant to me. So I suppose this presentation tonight was something of a challenge, but a good challenge, and challenge is always good. Like Eamon, I came across by accident the gravestone in Grey Abbey of the young soldier who died in Dublin in the Rising, and it reminded me of the hidden stories from the Rising itself, the stories of those who were like him were killed in British uniforms, the civilians who died. There's the eyewitness account of the man being shot as he tried to remove his cart from one of the barricades. Stories of brutality on both sides during the Rising, and also stories of humanity. There's a story which I think is quite striking of one of the Irish volunteers who informed his Jewish employers, the Samuels, that they shouldn't open their shop on the morning of the Rising, and he walked with them through the city to try to get them to safety as far as St. Stephen's Green. So in approaching this tonight, I thought I would return to another alma mater in the media industry and go back to my roots in a local newspaper, because in the course of my time as a journalist, I would have researched extensively in our local newspaper, often to the point of nearly being able to remember what was in particular editions, which was a bit frightening. But the weekly newspaper is a useful recorder of events and incidents and outlooks and a barometer of opinion. And coming from a newspaper background, I thought it would be quite interesting to look at the Easter Rising through certainly the columns of local Unionist newspaper and also the newsletter as well as a more provincial newspaper. I think in reading more widely about the subject, the newspaper has reflected very generally the feelings and the outlook of the period from a Unionist perspective. One thing which the leader writer of the Larne Times and Weekly Telegraph of early May 1916 and the leaders of the Easter Rising had in common probably was their sense of the inevitability of the consequences of their actions in Dublin. And the accounts of the court-martials of the leaders and some of their statements, including some of the references we've had earlier tonight, indicate their view that the sacrifice had to be made in order to awaken the Irish spirit. For an entirely different reason then, the leader writer of the Larne Times and Weekly Telegraph also believed the inevitable outcome of the rebellion for the leaders should be the harshest punishment. He said, "We want an era of strict justice for all concerned. They have done their worst and they regret nothing save their failure. These are no subjects for mercy. Every man of them knew perfectly well the consequences involved in the failure of their scheme, and they accepted the risk deliberately and consciously. If the government wishes to discourage all future attempts of the kind, the one way to do so is to make it clear now that there will be no trifling with treason, and that all who took part in it shall pay the full penalty for their misdeeds. And the paper then went on to warn that mercy to traitors is rank injustice to the loyal. The Larne Times and Weekly Telegraph, I should say, also was from the Baird stable of newspapers, which included the Belfast Telegraph, and the Ballymena Times and Weekly Telegraph was a sister newspaper, and also the Northern Standard in County Monaghan, which was a Unionist newspaper and continued to be so into the early 1920s. So the Unionist credentials were without question, really, in terms of the paper. And focusing on that paper and the more general, the Belfast newsletter, there's an interesting microcosm of Unionist opinion. The response of the newspapers, and particularly in their leader columns, and the Unionist public, is unlikely to be very different to any great degree once the news from Dublin had emerged. And I think the main ways I would categorise the responses evident in the columns of the newspaper would probably be as follows. A sense of outrage against those who had rebelled. B, criticism of the government policies, which had been seen as encouraging the rebellion. C, the view that the rebellion was treason and treachery against loyal Irish soldiers fighting on the front line against the Germans. D, highlighting then those killed in the military and the Royal Irish Constabulary, not only in Dublin but in other parts of Ireland by the rebels. And then lastly, the sense of outrage that Irish nationalist leaders appeared to be sympathising with the leaders of the rebellion, as was evidenced with a response to John Dillon's statements in the House of Commons about the executions, for example. The first indications in the newspapers, and I suppose we have to transplant ourselves back 100 years and think of a time when news was not as immediate or as available. So the first indications that anything was amiss in the context of a daily newspaper in the newsletters case came because the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland failed to turn up in Belfast, where he was going to undertake some engagements in Belfast, Armagh and Londonderry. And the Belfast newsletter reported on April 25th that the Lord Mayor of Belfast and Lord Basil Blackwood, the Lord Lieutenant's Secretary, had effectively been stood up at the Great Northern Railway Station waiting for the Vice-Regal party, which had not arrived, nor indeed had the train arrived from Dublin. And a lot of rumours started, and they left then with these rumours circulating about what had happened in the capital. A later train arrived near midnight, brought some passengers who also brought news, dissipating some of the rumours, but also certainly adding to the news that was coming into Belfast at that time. The account of this incident then in the paper sits alongside a report that a German attempt to land arms on the Irish coast had taken place and that Sir Roger Casement had been arrested. So the educated reader could have drawn the inference at this early stage that the two incidents weren't entirely unconnected. On April 25th, the editorial column was very differential, and it commented that in the absence of any official news from the government as to the state of affairs, quote, all that we feel we are entitled to say in the absence of any official announcement is that events which happened yesterday in Dublin disclose a most disquieting state of affairs in that city, unquote. So very deferential indeed, and not the way media would operate today. The April 26th edition said that the newsletter had, quote, a pretty fair knowledge, unquote, of what had occurred in Dublin, but had no firm news to report, not least because, quote, our telegraphic supply of news has been entirely cut off, as our columns today bear testimony. We cannot question the wisdom of this procedure, since we cannot convey to our readers any idea of the circumstances under which the government is acting in order to deal with, quote, the disturbances in Ireland, unquote. The leader of the paper column commented. The next day, the paper was able to bring news of the events in Dublin as the government had issued an official statement, and the Unionist response was coming through at that stage to blame the Chief Secretary, Burrell, for a policy that had encouraged the rebellion. That said he had been, quote, the greatest absentee and the most indifferent to the real welfare of the country. And the leader writer accused him of being a puppet of John Redmond, and that this had resulted in what had transpired. Quote, he has governed Ireland, as Mr. Redmond publicly announced on one occasion, through the United Irish League, and this is the result, the editorial column said. The response of blaming the government for allowing the conditions to develop that brought the rebellion about was also common then with the Larne Times and Weekly Telegraph. It added the Lord Lieutenant to the list of culprits. It said, quote, jail became a vestibule of the Vice-Regal Lodge. and the more notorious of these men had scarce quitted prison until they were found participating in and being lionised at vice-regal tea parties. It said on May the 6th, 1916. The same edition carried news of Burrell's resignation in the stop press box on the back page of the paper. And in the next week's editorial, it wasn't overly harsh on the Chief Secretary, described him as a broken man, noted his own comment that it had been encouraged not to suppress what it called Sinn Féiners in order to, quote, preserve the appearance of unity. And then it commented, in staring at the shadow of unity, he grasped the reality of open rebellion. So that was the type of response coming through in the editorial columns. The second response was essentially to rage against the disloyalty which this was seen as presenting. A very jingoistic article appeared on May the 6th, 1916, under the heading, a number of headings, Brave Irish Troops and Contrast to Dublin Scene. And it highlighted that the Enniskilling Fusiliers and the Royal Dublin Fusiliers had been in action at the front, and really with very barely concealed rage. The article, which was written by a special correspondent called H.F. Provost Battersby, and I really don't know if he existed or not, to be quite honest, with a name like that, commented, quote, there was retributive fitness in the fact that while renegade Irishmen backed by German gold were murdering the King's men in Dublin, their loyal brothers, wholly undaunted by the clouds of poison gas rolling over them, were driving their bayonets through German bodies and tumbling them over with bullets till the wire barbs were hung with twice a score of men. Not exactly heady bedtime reading. It was not, to be fair, the general tone of the reporting on the Easter Rising, but it does highlight a strong sense of the sense that while Irishmen were laying down their lives in the front line, England's difficulty was being utilised by Republicans well behind it then. The press also carried details on those injured and killed in the Great War in each newspaper edition, so the contrast with the rebellion in Dublin was then very clear. And the April 29th edition of the Larne Times was not sparing in its view of how Sir Roger Casement should be treated. It said, quote, one satisfactory feature of the business is the capture of that arch traitor, Sir Roger Casement, once a pillar of the Home Rule cause. It is to be hoped that there will be no weak sentimentality in dealing with him. He has been taken in arms against the country in whose service he formerly held a responsible position, and there should be but one punishment for his crime. Because that local paper, the Larne Times, was part of the Bird stable with all the other local papers, they also then carried the general news and news from across the world as well at that particular time. So readers in the town and in the surrounding areas and in Ballymena too became familiar with Constable Charles McGee, a native of Donegal who was shot 4 times by Republicans at Castle Bellingham and was a Royal Irish Constabulary member. The paper said no action of his could have been possibly construed as in any way provocative, but he was shot dead without a second's warning. And then there was a report highlighting a group of around 400 rebels had shot dead 7 policemen and injured 18 others in attacks in RIC barracks in Meath. Also, Oran Moore in County Galway, a policeman had been shot dead, and there were also reports of activities in Clare, Wexford, Cork, Louth and elsewhere being reported in the paper. So there was a growing sense that while Dublin may have been the epicentre of this event, the rebellion and the spirit that prompted it was not isolated to the capital through these reports. In Ulster, the consequences of the rebellion in the context of casualties were also reported, and there's at least 2 local men mentioned as having been killed. So, Second Lieutenant J.H. Calvert of the Royal Irish Rifles was the son of the clerk of Lurgan Union in County Armagh, and Second Lieutenant C.L. Crockett of the Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers was from Templemore Park in Londonderry, and there was a Captain McCulloch, MC of the Royal Army Medical Corps of Rosetta in Belfast, mentioned as being among the wounded. I couldn't find any reference to the soldier who's buried in Grey Abbey. He may have been too low down the regimental packing list, unfortunately, to be mentioned. The consequences then for the rebel leaders was a subject that the leader writer of the Larne Times already made their position clear on. And it also reported on the 6th of May on the stop press section, again at the back of the paper, that 3 of the leaders, Clark, MacDonagh and Pearse, had been executed. The following week then, the readers could pick up again that there were more extensive reports and photographs now of the rising appearing. A report of Grace Gifford's marriage to Joseph Plunkett prior to his execution, details of the further executions, and also the military casualties and the RIC casualties in the countryside. The following week, the paper editorial concerned itself then with John Dillon's condemnation in the House of Commons about the executions, and it attacked him, accused him of using the term insurgent as if it were an alternative term for a soldier and hero, as it put it. So perhaps in this, the Unionist press and public were at an early stage of misreading the signs. Some newspapers were carrying accounts of the rebels being pelted with rotten fruit by the wives of serving soldiers in parts of Dublin while they were led away after they'd surrendered. But the executions certainly proved a turning point, and the indications are at least some of the leaders, certainly Pearse, believed they would be. The Larne Times and Weekly Telegraph of May the 6th, 1916 said of the rebels, quote, "Many of them fought with a courage that merited a better cause." And historical debate could, of course, surround that sentiment a century on. But the prediction that, quote, "in the whirling clash of these great happenings, i.e. the Great War, the Irish rebellion will presently be little more than a memory," leaves really little room for debate at all. And it wasn't dissimilar to the comment actually in the Irish Times of April 28th, 1916. "The Dublin insurrection of 1916 will pass into history with the equally unsuccessful insurrections of the past." History has, of course, proved both newspapers wrong. From my university days, I remembered one line of a poem by W.B. Yeats, which was "A Terrible Beauty is Born," which comes from the poem Easter 1916. I have to confess I didn't remember anything else of the poem, but I remember that one line. It's a very graphic line, and I think it's very fitting in terms of the context of all of this. For Republicans, it was a beauty. It was the spiritual birth of a nation as far as they saw it. For Unionists, it was terrible. It was revolt, terror, death, destruction. And in totality, it was therefore a terrible beauty that was born. And so was the other 1916, the Psalm. A terrible beauty was born there too. And both of those events of that year certainly helped to shape us in our views of our past and of each other. And I think now is the time to look back, if not exactly in appreciation, then at least in measured understanding of those events. So thank you very much.